Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researchers Celebrity. Today we have honor to have Dr. Kevin with us to share the journey, a brief introduction of Dr. Kevin. Dr. Kevin has done his bachelor's in medical microbiology and virology from University of Warwick. And then after spending some time in industry at Pfizer, he joined a PhD at Imperial College London with Professor Gil Elliott, post which he was awarded as Sir Henry Wellcome Postdoctoral Fellowship from Wellcome Trust, and he got a dual appointment at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York and University of Bristol. Currently, Kevin is a group leader at the Pilbright Institute, UK. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Kevin at the platform. Dr. Kevin, thank you so much for taking time out for this conversation.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, this is such an interesting lecture series or conversation series. So I'm very interested in being part of it and hearing about other people's journeys as well. So yes, I'm very honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind words. We always start these conversations that how and when you decided that you want to become a researcher.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was thinking about this, reflecting on it before our talk. Um, so I think as a child, I was always very interested in nature. We spent a lot of time outdoors with animals, playing in the dirt. This was always the things that I loved growing up. And so I think I always had this curiosity around nature and how the natural world works. And that's still something that really drives me, just this pure curiosity about, you know, these little bugs. I study mosquitoes, right? So I'm curious about these bugs that we see out and about. Um, but I guess I enjoyed science. I was always very interested in science and understanding the world. And so through school, that was something that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed biology. Actually, biology was not my strongest subject. Like I was somehow much better at physics and maths, but I was really drawn to biology. And I think there's this interesting experience of really, really loving something, but having to work a bit harder for it that I think for me was really formative. So I really enjoyed that. And so I was very interested in biology. And I think also what really interested me when I started looking for degree programs is there was a lot of talk in the media about bird flu. So this was in about 2000, 2001 was when I was starting to make those decisions. And yeah, I was reading a lot about bird flu. So that's kind of, I think, just the idea that you can study the natural world, but it has an interest, an implication for people's health and people's well-being, I thought was something that really drove me. So that's kind of what drove me to then study microbiology, I guess. Yeah.
Great. And I think the point which you make even more interesting to start this conversation with is you have a core strength, as you mentioned, that your interest to biology was overpowering than the strengths in physics and other subjects. And then you were like, okay, I'm ready to do whatever it takes more. I'm ready to walk that extra mile to pursue my passion in biology.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
having said that, with this undergrad degree, how long it took for you to commit to PhD, and then what were the main reasons for you to bring to the grad school?
Yeah. So this is actually, I think the, I always think that I've sort of accidentally ended up in this journey. Um, so I thought I'd actually maybe to take a step back just to give a bit of my background. So I mean, I'm half German, I'm half English. I grew up in Germany and England, and where I grew up in England, it wasn't a very within the British context, not a very socioeconomically uh, how do you say it? Like there were not many opportunities. So for me, I'm the first person in my family to physically go to university, like straight after school. So my parents, they have an education. The education system in Germany is a bit different. So my father didn't really go to university, but he got sort of like a degree level education in a different way. And my mother came to it later, and they did a lot of remote learning. So actually going to university was not like the obvious choice. And still in my family, actually, I have two brothers, so the three of us are the only ones who really went to university. Um, So you say about biology and PhD, even doing the undergraduate degree in biology, all of my family is that they're sort of electricians, postmen. Some of them don't have jobs. Some of them went in and out of prison. So kind of we're a mishmash. So I always got this question: why would you study biology, right? What's this going to do? I think they would have understood if I did engineering or medicine, because there's a job at the end of it, right? For biology, they couldn't understand what does this go to. So I was never really thinking about a PhD. I never really had this attraction to academia. I think, there's this idea, I think if you don't come from that background, it's this ivory tower that maybe seems a little bit not accessible. So the way I got to the PhD is that I had very early experiences, you mentioned, in industry. So where I grew up, really the only employer outside of schools or the medical professions was that we had at the time Pfizer, so a really big, well, the largest at the time pharmaceutical company in the world, and they did a lot of outreach to schools. So I got really great opportunities to, during school and shortly after school, work in their labs for short, a couple of months, short periods of time, and that really got me hooked. But for me, it was always about getting a job as a science in industry. I didn't have this idea of going into academia. And then during my undergrad degree, I had the opportunity. It's very common in the UK actually that many degree programs offer this 1 year in industry. So at that point, I worked for AstraZeneca, so another big pharmaceutical company. So you can see I was sort of going down this trajectory of kind of the only thing I could think of as a scientist was you would go to pharmaceutical industry or a biotech company. And I really enjoyed that. But when I started to think about what to do next, there were two things really that made me think about doing a PhD. And the first thing was that I had this experience in pharma. I think it's quite common that I was working on a project that was really exciting scientifically, and then basically it was just cut from one day to the next because they just knew that there was a competitor who was 6 months ahead. Could be that the product would have been better. Could have been that the science was great, but for them they were never going to maybe have the business model because this other company was ahead. So I didn't like this idea that these decisions could be made for non-scientific reasons. I think I was always driven by actually wanting to make decisions based on the science. And the other thing I noticed was that in industry, if you did not have a PhD, there was a limit to where you could go. So you did not really go to any kind of managerial level. And it's not that I necessarily wanted right at that point to go to the managerial level, but I thought that I wanted the option. So somehow I kind of had in my head that I had to do a PhD if I wanted to have opportunities in science. So for me, I actually always thought I would go back into industry. I wanted to try academia. It was not something that I like I said, that it was really in my family experience, but I wanted to try it. And then I think I kind of ended up sticking around. But I do always have this question of, oh, maybe I should have ended up back in industry. But yeah, so that's how it was maybe not the traditional route. And we had a little bit of a discussion offline about actually that thought process of why you want to do a PhD, right, is really
Yes.
important. Yeah, because I think a lot of people, well, I see a lot of people in the UK, they do a PhD because it's the next step.
Hmm.
You do undergrad, you do a master's, you do a PhD, and they don't really think about why they're doing it. And I think for me, it really was a conscious decision. And so when I did it, I did go straight from undergrad to PhD, but I really knew that that was something that I wanted and needed for my career. So I think that for me, that was the thought process. It was not a traditional, I think, straight route through academia, I think for me.
So these are the conversation where we always try to bring this up, that being the first generation graduates means so much. As you mentioned that things have not changed, I believe, around the world in past a decade. People still have this, okay, if you are the first generation graduate, so either you look for medicine or for engineering, where you know that at the end of that degree you have a job security. Whereas more and more PhDs are coming out, and for some, it is just the next move, as you brilliantly mentioned that, okay, I have done undergrad, I have done masters, now, okay, let's do PhD. But what is the most important part of even committing to PhD is that what are you going to do with that degree? Do you see that as a piece of paper, or do you see that as a training which you are training yourself for the rest of your life, and you are committed to the lives of budding researchers or the people at that point of time who are not even into the science, and you are going to shape their career and you are going to work as a team, which for you, as you mentioned, was a very conscious decision that, okay, I want to do this. I have my reasons, I have my reservations, and I want all this full commitment into this. So let's start about this experience of grad school. Now,
Mhm.
once you have made all these decisions that, okay, I am ready to dive into it, how was that journey of PhD?
Yeah. So I was very lucky with the lab I ended up with. Jill is a fantastic mentor, and I feel like she gave me that best start in science because she's very focused on doing really rigorous science. Like everything's about like the quality of the science. She built a really nice team. It was a very supportive environment for me. So I felt very supported, which as well I think is important when you're choosing your PhD, right? So I think I felt very safe, very supported in the environment, and I really learned so much about her from her about how to do science in a very rigorous way. And I think I see as well some of the same tendencies now. I think Jill and I, we're both not the fastest to publish our papers, but when we submit our papers, they're very complete stories. Even if they're sort of smaller stories, you already make sure that you've kind of addressed a lot of the comments that reviewers might come up with. So maybe my students are not so happy because it takes a little longer and I make them do lots of experiments that maybe they don't want to do. But, I think it's important that then the science that goes out is very rigorous. So that was a really good training. But I think I had this common experience that many people have where the first half a year of my PhD, nothing worked. And it was actually, I have to say, it was a bit of a transition, right? Because I'd got this industry experience and there's so much more money in industry. And so, I think when I was in industry as an undergraduate student, I was able to, spend 1 month. So in my PhD, say what would have been 1 month's worth of research budget, I could spend in a day and I didn't need any approval, right? This was like the level of the difference in how much money. And of course, I understand that then globally is as well, there's differences in different countries as how much money is available. So I did have a good amount of research money in my PhD, but it was very different from industry. So I was used to buying in all of my gels. I was used to just, if I needed something, we would just pay for it to be done. I learned obviously how to work in the lab, but very different on the PhD, right? Because on the PhD, you have to do it all yourself. You have to pour your own gels. So this was a bit of a transition. And then, yes, I guess I'd come from a project that worked in industry, was lucky. And then it didn't work for 6 months, nothing worked. And I think I understood later in the PhD scientifically why it didn't work, but it was very frustrating being at the bench. Every day you're doing good science, the experiments are well set up, and just the results aren't coming. Um, so that was quite frustrating. But then I think eventually things started to work. And I think another lesson learned was, so after that first half a year, so maybe to say, so my project was really about molecular protein-protein interactions that are involved in assembling herpes virus particles. It was a virology PhD. So we started off by just looking, taking your proteins and looking and seeing do they interact if we transfect them into cells, and this didn't work. And then we moved to infection, and then suddenly everything started working. And I guess we started to find that you need lots and lots of different viral proteins and remodulation of the cell and different organelles for those interactions to be visible on a Western blot or in an immunoprecipitation. So I think I also learned that, it's important to maybe try a few different things at the same time, and then once something works, you just kind of run with it, right? So I think at the start of a project, whether it's at a PhD or maybe postdoc level, it's good to try a few things. Something will work, and then you kind of double down, right, onto this, like, this is working, let's run with it, let's kind of go down here because, you know, you can waste a lot of time, I think, struggling with these questions that aren't going anywhere because of some technical issue that you just can't resolve. So yeah, so I was very lucky with that training, and I'm still friends with a lot of the people that I met. There was a really nice virology community. It was actually, I think, a kind of a bit of a golden moment for that department because when you look at like a lot of the PIs in the UK we all kind of studied in that department at the same time. So, a really large proportion of us came from, maybe we were PhD students or postdocs. So, even when I moved to the Pirbright Institute, there's something like 24 PIs. I think something like 6 or 7, we were all in, Imperial at that time. So, you really make those connections really early on. And it was really very vibrant environment. So, yeah, I definitely enjoyed it. But yeah, it wasn't always the easiest journey, I think, like most people's journey isn't super easy, right?
Absolutely. I think this is something which, whenever in these conversation, if somebody says that was a piece of cake, I always like, wow, we have rarest conversation at this point of time because it's always this ride, which I believe that beats any of this roller coaster in the world. Because on one day of your PhD, you think you are the top of the world, and on one day you believe, as you said, that nothing is working for straight for 6 months, and
Yeah.
then how much of frustration it takes to mature a scientist. So we'll talk about, if it is successful, nobody talks about it. Okay, it's like, okay, yeah, you have done great, but what
Mhm.
it takes is that number of hours, days of that time when a researcher does not want to meet anyone. They just want to go back into shell, rejuvenate. And the most important learning of any PhD, which we call that as troubleshooting. So, where
Mhm.
you actually understand that biology should work in a certain way, and most of the time it actually follows the rule. Sometimes, yes, there are things which comes by surprise, and that's why we always say that the observation is the key for any researcher. You cannot just miss on.
No, that's so important. And I think the troubleshooting, I think that's where you learn, right? I learned very early on, even when I was already in industry, that, if something works first time, you have learned nothing, right?
Yes.
You only learn when it's not working because that's when you really understand your system, I think.
And
Yeah.
as you mentioned that when you moved from industry to academia, in industry, you touched everything and then everything was working brilliant. So when now with all this shiny, rosy picture of research, you committed yourself to PhD and then suddenly nothing is working for those 6 months. So the lessons learned from those 6 months and then how now you can guide the coming the young researchers early into their PhD, how they should approach this.
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. And I think it's different for everyone because some people experience that barrier for a very long time, right? They might have a whole year of a project. I remember I had a PhD student during the COVID lockdowns. It was a very difficult time. We weren't able to be in the lab at the same time to train people. Yeah, and I think he spent something like a year and a half on a project that really didn't work. And we couldn't understand why, because actually it had worked before. But in the end, we had to move on. So I think as now as sort of the I think an important part of my job is getting that fine balance of keeping people motivated for long enough to really exhaust that question. You know, is this ever going to work? But then also sometimes making the call and saying, look, we have to move on to something else. And actually, in that case, we just moved to a different project, which worked, and it's sort of really nice data that came out of that. But I think that's something where, like now as a PI, you have the slight step back and it's a bit easier to make that call. Like we need to move on to something else. I mean, I always say to my lab members, it's important to have something outside of your science. I think when you've had this frustrating day or this big week, if there's something that keeps you motivated, like, I'm training for a marathon and like I will be good at that marathon, right? Or whatever it is you're doing, maybe it's just that you're at home, you like, knitting, or you have some other project that just gives you a bit of joy. I think that helps give you some reflection and realize that it's not you, it's just something to do with the project, that you can be good at other things, and it's not that you're not good at your science, it's really just some problem with the project. And I think often just taking a break helps. When you've really been working at something for like a few months, half a year, and it's just not working. If you go away for a week or two and you come, actually, there's this classic example, you come back, you think you've done exactly the same as you did before, and it just works. And you just, You don't know. I mean, I remember during my PhD, it was actually kind of the most embarrassing thing because I had been working with these antibodies and Western blots for a long time. They were working perfectly, and then they stopped working for 2 months. No idea why. And at some point, I couldn't understand why. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to step back to basics. Let me go right back to the start of my lab book, right? Read what have I been doing? What's changed? And at some point, as I was copying the protocol from one page to the other, I had copied the secondary wrong. So I was supposed to be using a mouse secondary antibody, and I copied it as a rabbit, and just somehow then I was using rabbit, and of course it didn't work, right? So I think sometimes taking that step back, taking a break, going right back to the start if it was already working, or going to the literature, to understand what other people have done when they have got it to work. And I'm also a very big proponent, and maybe this is something that I can help people with more as a PI in my lab, is connecting people to other researchers who've maybe worked with the same technique. Because you read a paper and there's a lot of detail missing. And I think there's nothing like just speaking to the postdoc in that lab who got it to work, and they will tell you that one trick that wasn't in the paper that they had to do to get it to work. So I think that's something where obviously when you start out, you don't always have those connections. And so as a PI, I see that as kind of an important part of my role, right? To actually say, look, we can actually just contact that lab. So yeah, I think speaking to other people is very important. And then taking some breaks and times out for yourself to keep your personal energy high.
Absolutely. And I think a very important point which you brought up here is about going to the basics. Then nothing can replace that, how detailed you have written down your protocol. And then this is just a human behavior, because there are two type of researchers. One who write down every single detail, whatever they have done. Second, they memorize everything in their head and then they never write it down, which is fine. Everyone has their own way. But if you have to go back after months or probably a year or two, that's where you cannot rely on memory, that on certain day of that month of that year, what you have done, probably you're great at memorizing things and then your memory is working great. But after 3 years, if anything stopped working and you would miss out on those details, you just now again going to start from the scratch, which can be saved. As you mentioned, that if you have written down everything, you can just go turn the pages and then you're like, okay, this is where I missed and now I know it. Part of troubleshooting is so much important. And then second point, which you mentioned, that connecting the students with the experts, that, okay, we followed a research article. There was this just one thing which was not mentioned in the paper anywhere. And because we are trying to replicate it or trying to follow their methodology, and this one piece of link is missing, and then nothing is working. But the role of the mentor, that, okay, let's try to communicate with them. And this is, I believe, that one of the most fantastic things of this technology, that now we are blessed in a way that if we talk about research 50 years ago, you have to write letters, wait for months, sometimes years to get response from them, and then collaborate. With this fast-paced research, you can write an email, get a response in 24 hours if you're lucky, sometimes even in an hour or so. But then you have this, there is this community to help you to come out of it, but you have to seek that help. So now the point from a graduate student who wants to get help or these connections made all around the world, how they should approach their PI without hurting their feelings, because that is a very thin connection where people talks a little bit about, you are not questioning the authority, but you are committed to your timeline, where a mentor should make this balance.
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a difficult question, right? Because I think every PI is different.
Yes, Absolutely.
So some people, there are some people who are just not receptive to this, which is, I think unfortunate. But I think, and also every relationship's different, right, between a PI and their student. And I think we all know that not everyone in a lab always has the same relationship with their PI. I think, I don't know how it is in other places. In the UK now, actually, students tend to have multiple PIs. PhD students tend to have multiple supervisors, different for postdocs. But they have usually in the UK at least two. At Pirbright, we tend to have three or four for various reasons. But um, so if you're not getting anywhere with your PI, I think you often as a PhD student at least, you have a few more avenues in the UK context to maybe speak to another supervisor. Maybe they can help mediate those discussions. And even if you don't have sort of two supervisors, maybe there is someone else you can speak to, even if it's a postdoc in the lab who maybe has been around for longer, who maybe understands more about how to approach the PI about these questions. I mean, the way I approach it, I guess I see my role really as a PI to facilitate people's research and to facilitate their training. So if we can't provide that training in my lab, I really would rather people even went to another lab, if we can find the money for them to go to the lab and learn from those people. So I'm quite open to this. I don't see it really as a challenge. See it actually almost as a way to enrich our lab because I only have some experiences, right? And actually, as I've gone through my career, we've picked up some research strands that have become very important in my lab. So we do a lot of now in vivo experiments in mosquitoes. I have never touched a mosquito other than to kill it, right? The flies tries to bite you, you swat it. I've never done any research on this. And so I've always had to hire people who actually bring that knowledge to my lab. So I'm very open to, if you don't have someone in the lab who knows how to do it, then yeah, I always like to send people out. I mean, as a student, yeah, it can be I think it can be difficult. I think because some PIs are quite open and receptive to you having those conversations. And then I think it's easy. I guess we're talking here about the discussions when maybe PIs have a slightly different dynamic with their students. But I think just being honest about why you're in the lab can be helpful. You're there to train. You're not going to be in that lab forever, right? You want something to get out of it, or maybe you want to enrich your experience, or maybe it's even just this lab's great. This lab's fantastic. I'm really enjoying my training, but I actually want an experience that's maybe a little bit different because that will enrich my CV. It will give me different perspectives. It actually looks very good if you've had an experience outside of your lab, when you apply for your next step. So that is an argument that I think quite often will work with a PI. I think a lot of PIs have the experience of moving around. I think there are a few PIs who maybe start in one place and stay there for their whole careers. And so I think, framing it in terms of the experiences you want, without making it too much about you think that the lab's not the right place for that science. I think, and I think PIs are usually receptive to you bringing new things to the lab because it will enrich their ability to do research and actually probably will become integrated into the lab. So I think having those discussions, if you can have them, Frank, and if you feel like you can't have those discussions with your PI, I think it's always, approach the postdoc or another student, someone who maybe, is a little bit, has maybe a different relationship with the PI, or maybe even to go to, if you have other supervisors, maybe there's an ability to maybe bring that discussion to the table through other people can also, I think.
So we started with the undergrads, then the PhD, then from your postdoctoral training, when was this that you were like, okay, now I want to become a PI? Because what has been seen in this current scenario, that sometimes this postdoc duration is more than a decade.
Yeah.
It is, yes, the limitations for the opportunities, but sometimes what has been observed that a person who sees PhD as the next step, undergrads, masters, PhD, they are never prepared that they have to see themselves as a PI at one point of time.
Yeah.
So how you can guide these researchers who are passionate about research, but it's just this, the logistics of the systems, which they have to prepare themselves well in advance for.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually kind of, I actually tend to think this is one of the problems with the system, right? So you can be a really great researcher, but there's no long-term career for the most part if you don't become a PI. And actually, being a PI is a very different job that I think I hadn't really appreciated. And I think no one really fully appreciates. It's like maybe having children. You don't really fully, you have an idea about it, but you don't really fully appreciate it until you have them. So I think, yeah, I do know people who took a little longer. And sometimes that's about confidence, isn't it? And just seeing yourself in that role. And that's where I think mentorship's important, getting mentors who can support you and help you really believe in yourself that you can do it. I think my route was a little bit different because I had this fellowship which already was sort of encouraging people to be a little bit independent. So the idea was this was a postdoctoral fellowship. So it was you had 4 years of funding, which paid for your salary and some research money. And the idea was that you would develop your own program that you could take with you to become a PI. And it didn't always work for everyone. Some PIs didn't let them take the research, but that was the idea. And the idea would be that you would go to a lab where you could learn, and it was a sort of when you apply, you had to explain why that lab was the best place to learn. So it's sort of interesting, actually, if I take a step back, the reason I applied for the fellowship was not really because I thought I wanted to go down that route. The reason I applied for the fellowship was because I had gone to a conference in New York, and this is, I think, where really conversations with people over coffee, over lunch are so important. And I was just going to go to the conference in New York, and I was in my final year of my PhD, and just one of my postdoc friends said, if you're already going to New York, you should contact PIs, right? And speak to people because you're going to look for postdocs. Just see if anyone will like give you an interview. I had never thought about this. I was sort of just happy doing my lab science. So I contacted a few people and I ended up really kind of really sort of falling in love with the ethos and the science of Ana Fernanda Sesma, who I ended up doing my postdoc with in New York. And it just seemed like a great lab to do science, a great lab to learn about maybe some things that I hadn't learned around in my PhD in terms of running a research group that's very collaborative with lots of outward facing collaboration. So, and I wanted to live in New York. So I think I always like to tell people like a lot of the decisions we make in science is kind of actually more about life. So I just really at that time wanted to leave London, wanted to live in New York. And so Anna had no money. So I applied for funding and I didn't really think about, um, I applied for lots of funding. Of course, most of it I didn't get, but I got this fellowship and I hadn't really sort of maybe thought about the fact that this was preparing me to be a PI. I just wanted a postdoc in New York with Anna and of course to develop some ideas. And so actually it's that fellowship kind of because of the way that the funder treated you and because of the way that we had these conferences of all the other fellows, it actually made you talk about your own science in a way that you already were owning it. So I think for me, the journey was a bit different. And I think actually, I think this is something where, as a PI, but also as a sort of student or a postdoc, getting some kind of, if you have the opportunity to get a fellowship, even if it's a year or something, or some kind of funding where you can own that project, that's a good way to test the water, I think. Or if your PI will let you maybe design a project for a PhD student that you can really like, train them and deliver that's be in charge of like that science because I think that's where most of us get this feeling that we can do it. So that postdoc was really the time that I realized, oh, I can design my own research question and I can follow my own nose, surround myself with people who can support me in that journey. And I learned so much. And I did projects with Anna as well that were her projects. So I did work for her as well as my own project. But I think, yeah, that's how I kind of got to it. And I think for those people who maybe have been a postdoc for longer, I would really encourage them to try this out, like I said, right? To try a little bit about in a small way running your own project. And I've done this before. I always have these discussions with people in my lab. They come into my lab and I'm already like, what do you want to do in 5 years' time, right? And it's like their first day in their lab and they're kind of like, oh, I haven't really thought about this because this was the next step in my journey and why you're already talking about leaving again. But if someone sort of says like, oh, I'd like to be a PI or I would like to go down that route, I actually always kind of push them on that. Then I say, okay, well then in a couple of months' time, I'm going to ask you to come. What do you want to work on? What's your project going to be? What's your unique selling point? What makes you different from everyone else in the lab? So I guess as a PI, I'm already asking them to think about these things. Some people then have said, look, actually, I've just realized this is not for me, right? But I think that's that's a way that you can start thinking about that step, right? Giving yourself the opportunity to design even a really small project that's your own work. Um, yeah, so I think that was my journey, but I think it's different. I do see a lot more people who maybe took a bit longer, and it's just maybe the opportunities they've had and PIs who pushed them. I think some PIs push you more down that route, right? And then,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. So sometimes some people might need to push themselves to get
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
opportunities,
But I
right?
think, as you mentioned, the role of those the coffee conversations in any conference, and this is something which I always try to motivate not only the PhD students who are either in their later stages of their PhD, but even when you are starting, this is the time where you start building your own network, your niche, because by the end of your doctoral training, you already have these connections. There are people who are waiting for you to finish so that you can join that group. And vice versa, you already know that what will be your next move. That okay, after this training, I have learned this skill set here, but for starting my own research group, I need a little bit more, for which I can join a research group in any other part of the world or country, wherever. But if they can think it through, it will make their life easy. And this will help big time their PIs, because as you mentioned, sometimes you have to push yourself more than the PI pushing you, because in larger groups, and as you are leading a group here, you see that sometimes some of the researchers are in their shell doing the research, enjoying it, are they have a different personality, and then as a group leader you are dealing with different personalities, and that's what gives this blend of what we say, the different flavors of relationships, that sometimes you just enjoy the conversation with your lab mate, and then sometimes you're like, can we just do this some other time, because I need to rejuvenate myself for this conversation. So
Yeah, no,
having those conversations
that's
with the like as a PI and as a researcher in general, how you will suggest that both the mentor and the mentee should enter into this conversation?
yeah. I think it's really important to be sort of open and honest with each other, like early on, about what you both want. Um, I think everyone has experiences where maybe the time someone has in your lab or the time you have in someone's lab doesn't maybe go quite as well. And that's usually sort of a difference in expectations. So I actually now start when people come into the lab, one thing I learned is that I'm actually kind of much clearer about my expectations of not just about the science, but like how I expect people to behave in the lab and what I expect from them in terms of work and and what I don't expect from them, like, if I send an email because I've had time or a thought at midnight that they don't need to respond straight away. But so that helps because they know kind of where they stand. But also, I think it's important for when you go into a lab to think about what you want. I've had people come through my lab who have very different desires, right? So some people come in and they're like, I want to be a PI and I want to learn the science and I want the opportunity to set up like collaborations and maybe learn things that I didn't learn and get that experience of supervising people. But I've equally had people who've come in and said, I want to do a PhD because I want to go and take a lectureship and I just want to teach at a university level, right? And I don't want to do research. And that's fine, right? I still have the expectation that their project, that they would be committed to it, and that's part of their training. And they'll obviously need that when they do go into the university environment because they'll have to supervise potentially undergraduate projects. Um, but those are different. But these people want different things, right? So as a PI, then I can sort of try and get them the opportunities that they want. So the person who wants to go into teaching, I would maybe, if I hear about opportunities where people could get some teaching experience, right, then I would sort of make them aware of that. So I think thinking about, yeah, being kind of honest with what you want from that time in the lab. Um, and I think in general, I think just something that you said earlier triggered this thought was just, I think one thing that's really important in life as well as science, right, is actually to get outside your comfort zone, I think, and take different opportunities because you don't really know what you'll want or what you'll enjoy until you have that experience, right? So, you may not want to teach in the future, but actually, a lot of us end up in university settings and we have to teach, and actually, you'll need, it looks good if you have some experience of it. So, for example, and so I think if you have people, if you're going, it's not such a good idea, I think, to stay in the same lab. You might be very comfortable, but sort of doing a PhD, staying in the same lab and doing the same thing. It's good to move labs, and if you don't have the opportunity to move to a different city or a different country, just within the institute to a different style of leadership, different science, different skills that you build. And I think if you're always looking to do something a little bit different and taking opportunities when you see them, I sort of really believe in just like, if you see an opportunity, you say yes to it and then you work out later. So if you see the opportunity to maybe have some time in industry or some public engagement, I've always just gone for those opportunities. You don't always get them, but I think I've always put myself forward, and I've had lots of really interesting opportunities that really make you more aware of what you do want from your career and what you don't want. And sometimes for people that means, oh, now don't want to be in academia anymore. I'm going to go into something else. But you have a little bit of more experience and richer experience. So when you go and you apply for places, you can explain why you want that job. So I think taking opportunities is really important, and really trying to do things that are outside your comfort zone, balancing that with having to do lab work. But I think being too comfortable at the bench is a little bit probably not helpful. And so having those discussions with the PI as well and making sure that they're happy to facilitate that is also quite important early on, I think.
I believe that starting the stage with setting up the boundaries, the expectation is something which keeps on from day one of PhD to the graduation, when you have this keep on.
Yeah.
Sorry. So this was great having this conversation, and I believe that the researchers listening to this conversation now know after this conversation that there are things which that you are going to take as your path, and there are things which they should be keeping themselves open for opportunities, because as you mentioned, until you have done it, sometimes you don't even realize that this is where your core strength lies. You might be just looking at a different wall and thinking that, okay, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But when you get exposed to this opportunity where you said, okay, you were just, the maximum you have done was like, okay, let's try this. Yeah. And then everything changes after that. So that was a great learning lesson for, I believe, for all the researchers who are listening to this conversation. With this, we'll say thank you so much, Dr. Kevin, for sharing the journey and igniting these questions in the brain of the researchers who are now in the process of becoming the PI.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity. It's been so great having this chat. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll say at this end of the conversation, we always try to ask our researcher celebrities that we can, all the viewers can write an email to you directly if they are seeking for any help. They can write to STEM for Society to put them in touch with our researcher celebrity, so that we can build this niche where everyone feels safe and nobody feels left out, because research is tough.
Yeah, that's really important. Yeah, I'm very happy for that to happen and for people to contact me through you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin. And then I'll say for all the audience, stay tuned for another episode of Researcher Celebrity and try to make the most of this conversation. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you.